Hello, everyone. I'm Tigray, and I'm here to say a couple of things about some recent developments in Ethiopia and especially in Tigray. I have been trying to follow developments, of course, in terms of what the mainstream media trying to say and what the new narrative they are trying to cement is and all that. And I found the way that the mainstream media have been trying to reframe the story of the war to be interesting in a negative sense. So what I will do today is I'm going to reflect on that, and I'm going to tell you why my attention was drawn to that and why I found it to be deeply troubling. But before I go into that, I think I'm going to read two sentences, one from Bloomberg and another from the BBC. Although on the surface they look different, they are the same in essence in terms of the point that they are trying to drive at. But also there was a story on Reuters a couple of days ago that I couldn't find now. But the story it's more or less along the same storyline as the one on Bloomberg on the BBC. So Simon Marks, I think most of you will know Simon Marks is the Horn of Africa correspondent for Bloomberg, and he used to, he still writes on Ethiopia, and he used to be based in Addis, but he has been expelled because he ran foul of the regime, and now I think he's based in Nairobi, but he continues to write about Ethiopia and about Tigray. And yesterday he wrote the following: the power shift. So the power shift is in reference to the presidential election in Somalia that resulted in the former president being re-elected, and the belief, with good reason, I would say, is that he's likely to be more sympathetic to the Tigray government, given that he had worked with them when he was president, and when the TPLF dominated Ethiopian government, supported him in his fight against Al-Shabaab. So there is some sort of I wouldn't say friendship, but some sort of camaraderie between the two that emanates from that. So Simon Marks says the power shift has emboldened Tigrayans who are considering attacking the Eritrean capital Asmara, according to 3 diplomats in the region who spoke on condition of anonymity. So Simon Marks is making an extraordinary claim. He's telling us that the Tigray government has been planning not just to liberate Western Tigray, that is still occupied by Eritrea, but to go all the way to Asmara, and apparently, although he doesn't state it explicitly, to bring about regime change. And then a similar story was featured on the BBC yesterday, written by a correspondent based in Addis, and he doesn't specify his sources, but I think the story is based on what the Eritrean information minister had tweeted. But anyway, the correspondent, the BBC correspondent in Addis says the following. Eritrea says forces from Tigray are preparing to launch an attack on Eritrea and in areas in the disputed Western Tigray. So they are both the same story, but the BBC story adds that the Tigray government is planning to launch an attack on Eritrean troops occupying Western Tigray. So I found the way the story is being framed and the point that they are trying to drive at and how they are trying to paint the Tigray government in negative light to be deeply disturbing. And I'm going to reflect on that, on why I thought it's deeply disturbing. But before I go into that, I think it would make sense if I started by saying a few words about what the Tigray government has been trying to do and how the Tigray government has been trying to put an end not just to the occupation of Western Tigray, but also to the much bigger problem of the Ethiopian regime imposed starvation of Tigrayans. So first to clearly specify the problem, Western Tigray continues to be occupied mainly by Eritreans, but also by Ethiopian Defense Forces and the Fano Vigilante Group and the Amhara Special Forces. So an assortment of forces have created an alliance and continue to occupy Western Tigray. So that's one problem that the Tigray government has been trying to solve. The other problem that I briefly mentioned is the cordoning of Tigray, right? The total blockade that has been sieged on Tigray, with only a trickle of aid allowed to get in to make sure that the Abiy regime is seen in positive light. So those are the two big problems that the Tigray government has been grappling with and has been trying to solve. And the Tigray government has been trying to avoid direct military engagement. And that was the reason why, I think about 6 or 5 months ago, the Tigray president wrote a powerful letter to the Secretary General of the UN, pleading with him that the UN had fundamentally failed Tigray, but that it wasn't still too late to try to help. And Debretsion requested and asked and implored the Secretary General to use all the tools in his power to find a way to bring about a solution to the two problems that I mentioned. And Debretsion goes on to provide some suggestions as to how that could be achieved. And he gives proposals that any reasonable person would deem to be not just feasible but also very reasonable. So he says that Eritrea should be made to leave Western Tigray, Ethiopian forces should leave Western Tigray, and perpetrators of serious crimes should be held to account, or at the very least the UN should put in place a mechanism whereby that could be effected. And to the extent that there are minor problems between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray government, they could be resolved through negotiation. So Debretsion makes a very watered down, reasonable set of recommendations that the UN could do to lessen the suffering in Tigray. And expectedly, of course, the UN simply ignored the plea and the request of the Tigray government. And the Secretary General has never said a word, not just in response to that, but also generally he has totally avoided the issue of Tigray. So the Tigray government has absolutely given up on the UN, from what I could discern. And I think as a result of that, as a result of the Tigray government giving up on the UN, about 3 months ago, Debrecen wrote another letter, this time to the AU commissioner, asking him more or less the same request that he had made to the UN, but also he added that the UN should find a way for Eritrea to leave Tigray, but also Ethiopia. Debrecen makes the claim, I think with good reason, that Eritrean security agents have infiltrated the Ethiopian security apparatus, and Debrecen says that as long as they remain in Ethiopia, as long as they are running the show, orchestrating, pulling the strings from behind the scene, there won't be lasting peace in Ethiopia. And I think those of you who have been following developments over the past couple of days will know the extremely destructive role that Eritrea must be playing in Ethiopia. There has been stories of abduction, of disappearance, and of even murder. And it's a case of Eritrean security agents in Ethiopia running amok. And Debrecen suggested a solution to that, which is that the African Union should use all its tools and tell Eritrea to leave, to pack up and leave Ethiopia. And just like the UN, the AU has also, of course, ignored Eritrea, but of course that was to be expected, because the AU doesn't even want to recognize that there is any problem in Tigray. So the Tigray government has been going way out of its way to avoid military engagement, to avoid war, and to try to engage the international community to find a peaceful resolution to the problems. And it has been invariably ignored by all bodies. So it has been left with no option but to directly engage the Eritreans and the remaining Ethiopian forces militarily, right? So it could be true that the Tigray government has indeed been planning to engage them. So I'm not really interested in the veracity of the stories. They could be true. I'm interested in the way that they are framed. Now, given the problem that I described earlier, given that a huge swath of Tigrayan territory remains occupied by a foreign force, given that the entirety of Tigray remains totally blockaded, it would make sense that the Tigray government would have a plan to end that. And whatever plan that is, any reasonable person would see that as a defensive move and not an offensive move. And that's the first point that I want to make. That if indeed the Tigray government has been planning to engage the Eritreans, it must be seen as a defensive, as a last resort defensive move, and not an offensive. Just imagine, and it's easy to see that if you if you kind of use the example of Ukraine, for instance, right? If any serious reporter wrote that Ukrainians are the aggressors, or they are the ones who are launching offensives, that person would lose their job immediately, because that's an egregious claim to make, right? But in the case of Tigray, reporters like Simon Marks, like the BBC correspondent, like the Reuters correspondent, feel comfortable making the claim that the Tigray government is planning on an offensive, when in fact the Tigray government having been left with no option but to engage the forces, is making a defensive move. So I say I'm trying to set the record right, because I believe there is an orchestrated campaign to try to paint the Tigray government in negative light, so that the Ethiopian regime will find an excuse to, number one, continue the blockade, but also so that Western powers will find it easy to work with the Ethiopian government for business interests to advance their national interests. So I do deeply believe that it's not a case of reporters getting the story wrong. It's a part of an orchestrated campaign to paint the Tigrayans as the aggressors, so that the Ethiopian government could be absolved of all its crimes, so that it could be cleansed of all the crimes that it has committed, so that Western powers and Western countries could find it easy to work with the Ethiopian government. And we must refute and rebuke and repudiate this kind of narrative, the narrative that tries to paint the Tigrayan forces as the ones launching offensives, when in fact, like I said before, the only thing that they are trying to do is to protect Tigray, because they have a responsibility and a duty bestowed upon them by the Tigrayan people to protect them from aggressors and to protect Tigray from invaders as well. So they have to have a plan to make sure that the territorial integrity of Tigray is respected and that Tigrayans are safe. And if the Tigray government did not try to engage the international community, if it preferred war over peaceful resolution, then it would be one thing. But the Tigray government has been trying everything to engage the international community, everything to avoid going into war. Given those, to paint that they are now trying to open an offensive is wrong at best, but dangerous at worst. And I say dangerous because if the Ethiopian regime finds an excuse to continue the total blockade, it's going to stop the whatever little aid has been trickling into Tigray, because it has become an established norm in Ethiopia now to condition aid on the Tigray forces remaining quiet. So the only reason that whatever number of trucks have been getting into Tigray is because the Tigrayans haven't shot even a single bullet. But if they were to open an attack against the forces in Tigray, the Ethiopian government would use that as an excuse to withhold aid. And that has become a totally accepted standard, although it shouldn't have become accepted standard in the first place. But since we are in strange times, that is what the Tigray government is dealing with. It has to be seen to be quiet for little aid to trickle into Tigray. So serious reporters must be extremely careful in how they tell the story of the so-called Tigrayan offensive on Eritreans. So that's the first point that I would like to make. But the second point is the whole assumption in saying that war is about to start. The assumption embedded there is that the war had stopped, but it hasn't. What happened was that the Ethiopian regime concluded that direct military engagement with the Tigrayan forces wasn't sustainable because Ethiopia was running out of everything. So they had to stop the conventional war and resort to the silent war of using starvation as a weapon to quietly destroy and kill Tigrayans. So the war has not really ended to begin with. To say that the Tigrayans are planning on starting war is misleading, because the war is active, is ongoing. It's just ongoing in a different form. using starvation as a weapon, using the total isolation and the total blockade of Tigray as a weapon of war, by allowing a trickle of aid to get in, just big enough for the international community to be content, but small enough to make sure that the Tigrayans on the whole continue to suffer. So any serious reporter should try to get into the actual problem that the Tigrayans are facing, and try to explain why the Tigray government is having to plan for another round of a new form of the conventional warfare. So that was my second point, and I think those were the points that I had intended to convey today. And thank you for listening to me, and have a good time. Bye bye.